with the roll. President Masterson, are you here?
Can you hear me, David?
There we go.
Yes, all right, so you're going to have to call me Debbie for this meeting because we're having some technical issues, and I think that's what my name's going to come across like.
Okay.
Thank Debbie.
Sorry, Speaker Reichman, geez.
Here.
Sorry, Ron.
Here.
Speaker Reichman, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. Sorry for butchering your name. I do know who you are.
That's right, Jim.
Excellent. Secretary Burns Wallace.
I'm here. Good morning.
Hi, D'Angela. Mr. Orman. Greg, are you on? Okay, we'll come back. Mr. Picker.
Here.
Hi, Bill.
Hello.
And Mr. Rolfe.
Here.
Hey, John. Okay. Hopefully Mr. Orman will be joining us shortly. In the interest of time, so we have two agenda items today, the first being the Spark structure conversation, and the second being follow-up from last week on the nurse and frontline care worker funds. So why don't we go ahead and get started on the structure discussion and see if we can get these questions resolved so we can move forward with our original charge, which is to get $1.6 billion invested for the people of Kansas, which is really an extraordinary opportunity. And we're fortunate to be able to do this work. And so, but doing this work requires that we have a system and a process. And so we have Governor Kelly's Chief of Staff, Will Lawrence, who is with us, I believe. And Will, are you here?
I am, Lieutenant Governor. I'm having problems with my camera, but can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you. So Will, do you want to go ahead and take us through what's been hashed out, the various iterations of a proposed structure for the Spark Task Force committees?
Absolutely. Happy to. And there have been a variety of conversations, so I thought maybe it makes sense, since I was involved in a number of those, that maybe I walk through kind of where things started and where things are at, and then stand for any questions, and then let you guys take it from there. So I think everyone knows at this point we've had the proposal that was put together that's been labeled the private sector proposal. And then there was a counter proposal that came back that tried to meet in the middle on some of these issues and move the conversation along. And then we have used both of those as kind of a jumping off point to discuss where we could maybe find some alignment. And so you should have a one-page document that has 3 columns, one for the private sector proposal, one for the counter proposal, and then one for a final proposal. And hopefully that will be the final proposal or something near that. So there are really 4 areas of discussion that have been going on. First is the advisory panels, which I think everyone has been aligned on through these conversations, in terms of panels of 8 to 10 experts selected by the executive committee. I think where there's been some further discussion is on the priority areas and whether there would be 4 or 6 priority areas. And I think in the conversations where we landed is it made sense to collapse a couple of the 6 and make it simple and go with the 4, which are the economic revitalization, health and education, which we would view would be more encompassing, would allow for things like behavioral health and early childhood development, but would keep that fairly simple. Then connectivity and efficiency and modernization. The other two areas, staffing and timeline, have been the areas where I think they've received the bulk of discussion. On staffing, the private sector proposal started with 8 to 10 staffers and an executive director that reports to the executive committee hired by the executive committee. The counter proposal came back with 2 dedicated staffers in the legislative research department to support alongside the RO recovery office and the consultants, both BCG and Witt O'Brien. And the thinking in line there was trying to understand that there's a lot of work here and needing to make sure that there is sufficient support for the executive committee, but trying to make sure that we don't set up too complicated of a staffing structure that could cause some issues. And so where we kind of aligned and some based on conversations with this proposal is that you'd have one Spark program coordinator hired by the executive committee. And this would be essentially that executive director type position that was discussed in the private sector proposal, calling it something just a little bit different because there at times have been an executive director of the recovery office and trying to not have 2 people with the same title working in these spaces and trying to make sure it's as simple as possible. This person's role would be to report to and work with the executive committee and with the 4 priority areas or the 4 advisory panels and kind of be that liaison and help with the process. The second component of this is to use KLRD and the recovery office staff jointly to staff those advisory panels. And then the final piece would be ensuring that all the members of the executive committee have access to a dedicated point of contact with the consultants, BCG and Witt O'Brien. So that way, when there are questions or things you want to think through, especially when it comes to trying to work through the Treasury guidance, maybe getting information from various groups, you think of the hospital proposal and trying to get information from the hospitals, it gives everyone an opportunity to have someone to work with and have a rapport with and get that information. So that was the proposal, to try to split the difference there and not bring on a large number of additional staff, which we could have some difficulty in just also hiring. So that was kind of the thinking along those lines and kind of what I was hearing from all of our conversations that we were having. Third is the timeline. The private sector proposal had round 1 going to be completed by 3/15 of 22 with 400 of appropriations and 100 million of capital spend. Round 2 was 600 million plus any unallocated funds from round 1 and 40 million of capital spend done by 12/31 and 22, and then 100 million saved for follow-on investments. The counter proposal had 500 million in round 1 to be done by 12/31 and 21, and round 2 was the remaining 834 million minus any portions of that 250 that's earmarked for the UI trust fund that would go there. So that would assume that if there is any difference between the audit that was contained in House Bill 2196 and the total 500 million, that money that does not need to be transferred would then go into round 2. Based on conversations, what we came back with on the final was maintaining that round 1 of 500 million by 12/31 of 2021, so that we get some stuff moving through the end of this year. And then round 2 would be the same as the counter proposal, except for we changed the date of 7/31 of 22. I've heard some discussion that there may be some interest in maybe adding a round 3 and maybe taking some funds from round 2 and holding it back for a late round, which you think about the 250 that's earmarked for the UI trust fund based on that audit. I think that audit is in September when we get those results. So there's probably going to be some unallocated funds or some other funds that need to be shifted. So that might be kind of in line with the 100 million saved for follow-on investments that was in the private sector proposal. We'll leave that to the will of the committee to discuss that, but I thought I would note that as well. While that's not in this proposal, there have been some conversations about that, and wanted to make sure that I brought that up. With that, that kind of goes through the 4 areas and the key discussion points. So I am happy to stand for any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Will. We appreciate it. Questions from the task force about this proposal? Secretary Burns-Wallace?
So not too much a question. I do want to say just thank you to everyone as we've tried to work through and talk through this. And I know that we've been talking about it for a while. I do want, just based on what we've learned of how this money moves and additional guidance that we get, and how some of the rules can shift a little bit on us, I do recommend, as we think about this, what Will mentioned about having a additional like 3rd round, or that ability kind of later in the year, maybe that 12/31/2022, to be like kind of a holdover for any potential reallocations or things like that. Because things just change. If other bills come in later this year and we've allocated dollars for something, and a new bill comes through that those can cover those dollars, it'll give us an opportunity to shift funds, kind of like we did under CRF, and then have an opportunity to reallocate them later. Just builds us a little bit of flexibility in there. With that, I know we probably are going to have a little bit more discussion, but I'd like to make a motion to move us into that discussion on the motion, and then to go from there. So I'd like to make a motion to accept that final column that's as it is written and has been presented, with one minor change, is to create a round 3 for the potential as needed for any room or variation or reallocation that would be done by 12/31/2022. And so that's my motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Secretary. We do have a motion. Before we move into discussion, is there a second? Okay, let's go ahead with our discussion. Speaker Reichman?
Thank you. I thought we might have a little more discussion to see if so we're not having motions and substitute motions and things like that. I think we're really close. I appreciate the work on this and kind of the give and take. Just a couple things I want to clarify. I want to make sure, I think, and maybe Senator President and have to help me with this, or somebody from research. But in order for a small minor item, having our folks or KLRD folks, staff, the committees, it may need LCC approval. I think it's a great idea, but I wanted to just make that clarifying point that there might be another step that we have to do to authorize that. As far as the money goes, I talked to Will about this a little last night. I want to be cautious of it, putting timelines, especially this early. I'm comfortable with the up to, but I want hopefully the folks also in our groups to know that I think with time comes better ideas, more transparency with the public, and better ideas can come forward. And so I can be comfortable with the up to language, because that doesn't mean we're going to spend $500 million between now and 12/31 if the ideas are there. But I do believe with more time, with more information, the folks of Kansas will bring forward a lot of information or a lot of good ideas. And so as long as this body is comfortable with the up to language, knowing that we're not telling every one of our subgroups, this is the amount of money you have to authorize by the end of the year, I could be comfortable with this motion. Am I making sense?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. I also want to be clear that, just I'm not sure we're going to call the director, but the person that that this body hires is going to drive a lot of the discussion and kind of push the ideas coming forward based on feedback from this executive committee. And probably the other thing we need to discuss is who selects the private sector panels, or excuse me, who selects the panels? Is that something that we are going to put a name in the hat, something we're going to come with agreement with as a group, or something we do offline? Just know that we will come up with it later. Again, this started with Office of Recovery putting forward, the governor made all the selections. We've since backed off that drastically, but I want to make sure in the absence of conversation, we don't default back to someone besides this panel making the selections of those folks. That was a handful there. One was a kind of a clerical thing, making sure KLD can staff these subgroups. Two, and make sure these make people know that we need to slow this thing. If there's, again, the more time we have, the better ideas will come in the funding. I'm not saying we have to change what Secretary Burns-Wallace put forward, but just be cognizant of the fact that we're not requiring or pressing these subgroups to come with those type of recommendations this early in the process. Then, of course, I want to make sure that we're comfortable with this body selecting the panels.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I might just on the KLRD point, I think that's an important one, and we do need to get that checked out about whether they can staff and process-wise what needs to happen. On the point about it being up to, for example, in round one, up to $500 million, that is how it is worded, but your point is well taken. And then about the selection of the members of the panels, my understanding, and Will, if you could confirm this, but my understanding is it is this body that would be making those selections of the individuals to serve on each of the four proposed priority areas: economic revitalization, health and education, connectivity, and efficiency and modernization. But will you confirm that?
Yes, that is how it is stated, and that is our understanding. I think if I understand what Speaker Reichman is maybe getting at is making sure that, we say that we understand what exactly that means, and maybe it's kind of a process question about how we would go about doing that from here, because you're filling 8 to 10 slots, and there's been some discussion about then how do we do that, but yes, I think we're all, certainly from my understanding perspective, there's understanding and comfort with the executive committee being the ones making the ultimate decision on the membership.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I think this is one of those where we're building the airplane as we fly it, and the ultimate decisions will be made by this committee. We'll have to figure out how we take names and do the vetting and so forth, but those decisions will be made by this body.
So, Lieutenant Governor, this is
President Masterson.
So the way the motion was phrased, being approved by the committee, I mean, obviously from a parliamentary perspective, it would take a majority vote of this committee, right, to actually approve. So I would anticipate we would have a slate of some type that the committee would vote on for approval, because that's the way that would work, and that's the way I understood the motion. I agree with pretty everything the speaker commented on. I do think it would probably take an LCC action to approve legislative research since they're under, but that shouldn't be a problem if we're on the same page. We'd probably even have to do some minor budgetary adjustments for allow the Office of Recovery to make those salary payments out of there versus the legislative budget. So there's some logistical cleanup, I guess, if you will, with it. But I do want to echo Speaker's comments about the up to language, right? Want to make sure it's clear, we're not saying we're going to spend $500 million by December 31st. But I certainly think it's okay to have the up to language, to have the flexibility. For example, we were not talking about this 50 million 2 weeks ago. So depends what those issues are. So for that, with that, I'll go ahead and second the motion to continue the discussion.
Thank you, President Masterson. Additional discussion.
Mr.
Question.
Chairman, I've
Yes,
got
Rich.
sort of a handful of comments. First is it's really not fully clear to me what the motion is that we might be asked to vote on. I think what I would recommend, and certainly what I've seen in best practices sitting on public company boards and private company boards, is when you make a motion like this, something where we're taking action and even potentially spending money, that there's something in writing that's actually written with specificity, as opposed to sort of a grid with language on it that could be interpreted multiple ways. And I think one of the challenges that we have to overcome with this committee is making sure that we aren't interpreting what we do differently. Because I think if everyone sort of views it through their own lens, we may find ourselves having some conflict about exactly what we approve today in this motion. So I would sort of recommend that instead of approving this motion, if we can agree to the broad constructs of it, that someone actually write down on a piece of paper in full sentences what it is we're agreeing to, as opposed to just sort of agreeing to what's on this grid, which again, I don't know precisely what we're agreeing to. I would echo the speaker's comments as it relates to a couple of things. Number one, time frame. Having worked as a consultant at a relatively large consulting firm in the past, and I will tell you, 3.5 months where we don't have an executive director hired, where we don't have advisory panels appointed yet, is an awful fast time frame to think that we can spend $500 million and spend that money in a positive, constructive way in service of the people of Kansas. I've been involved in engagements in consulting firms where we were asking much simpler questions: how to organize a sales force, whether or not an airline should get into the air cargo business. And those projects took considerably longer because we wanted to make sure we were making good fact-based decisions. And so I think, again, with the inclusion of the up to language, I'm fine. But I would caution that if what that means is we're going to have a bunch of half-baked proposals rushed in front of us with limited time to really investigate what the alternatives are, that I'm going to be highly reluctant to vote yes on any of them, even the most well-intentioned programs, because I think it'll be made far too quickly. The other thing that I think there's some ambiguity around is who is controlling the work streams of the consulting firms. It's one thing to appoint an executive director for the Spark Committee, or a program manager, whatever we want to call it head bottle washer for all I care. But it's one thing to appoint that person, and then, entirely another thing to have all the analysis and the work streams that are being done controlled by others, because that will then define the universe of investments that we consider. And sort of to the point President Masterson said in our first meeting, we might find ourselves in a position where we're forced to choose between proposal A and proposal A. We won't have a reasonable set of proposals to choose from. So I think the other thing that we need to clarify is exactly how are those work streams being determined? How are we identifying the things that we want BCG to be working on? If all that direction's coming from the Office of Recovery, then I frankly would agree that a head bottle washer for us is a redundant position. I think we need someone in that role who's taking guidance from the Spark Committee, who's taking input from the advisory panels, and ultimately using that to fashion the work streams that we ask BCG and others to work on. I recognize the concern about the timing related to putting together our own staff. And so I recognize the desire to use BCG and others who are already in place, given the urgency there seems to be with getting this money out. But again, I think we might find ourselves in a position where we're presented with very limited options if the work streams that those consultants are working on is entirely dictated by the Office of Recovery, as opposed to something that's being dictated by this committee and ultimately through our executive director, program director, bottle washer, again, whatever we want to call it.
Thank you for your points. on the nature of the motion, I do think it's critically important that there be clarity around what that motion is. And Secretary Burns Wallace, maybe we can fashion this into the narrative that Mr. Orman has requested, which I think is as straightforward as having panels of 8 to 10 experts selected by the executive committee and going on down the line, so that it is in the kind of sentence structure that Mr. Orman's referring to. Clarity is essential to transparency. And so, so your point's well taken, Mr. Orman. On the time frame, agree completely about the importance of making good fact-based decisions. That's absolutely what we're going to do here. And but I think it's also important that we not have analysis paralysis with this. So we got to get the data in front of this group. It's got to be presented in a timely fashion, in a clear fashion, and then we need to make decisions. We're about 3 months in on the Spark process, and we're hopefully today going to agree on the process to go forward. And so I appreciate the importance of getting it right and agree 100%. We've also got to have a bias toward action and making these investments on behalf of the people, but making sure they're the right investments. So point well taken. And then question of the work streams of consulting teams. I think that's a good point. And I agree with you that we've got to have a diversity of options that are presented to this group so that we aren't choosing between option A and option A, but that we really can do the kind of cost benefit analysis and the weighing of different proposals that we've heard this group ask for clearly from day one. And so it's duly noted. So thank you, Mr. Orman. Other comments or questions from the task force members?
Lieutenant Governor, I would just add, I'm agreeing with both Speaker and with Greg. The reason I second the motion is because I too would not be inclined to vote for even a good proposal if it felt rushed and it was inappropriate at the time. So that's why with the up to language, that's why I'm comfortable with where it is, because I too, if we feel like we're only getting 3 bad options, or if things are rushed or the process isn't working in a way, I would be inclined to vote in the negative along with Mr. Orman. So
yeah, thank you, President Master. I think we all agree on that.
And I'll offer to do the bottle washing for free to save us some money.
You're well equipped for it.
I am.
Are you suggesting, John, that any of us are getting paid?
Thanks, John. Mr. Pickard.
Mr. Chairman, I would echo the concerns that have been expressed with regards to the timing. I think given the difficulty we've had getting this process started, I think getting all these advisory panels impaneled, getting our staff hired, and getting anything of any substance completed before December 31 is very, very optimistic. And I hope I'm wrong, but I can't imagine those panels having more than 1 or 2 meetings prior to the beginning of December or middle of December. And by the time you get to middle of December, you're basically done with the year. So I think that wildly unreasonable or unlikely that we're going to get anything accomplished by December 31, but I could be wrong. I mean, we can still react to things like this nursing and frontline workers proposal as needed as those things come up. But I'm hoping that we're going to end up with proposals for spending that are going to be transformative to the state and be well thought out. And I'm not saying that there's not a lot of good ideas already out there that we can advance. We don't have to come up with the good ideas all on our own, but I think that getting a consensus and getting a good, clear indication and understanding where we're going with this is going to take a little time, and we need to take that time. I have the same concern about the process. I don't know the difference between executive director and a program coordinator. Program coordinator sounds much lower in my mind versus an executive director, and getting something, actually having some authority and directing people to do things and working on behalf of the Spark committee. But I'll leave it to the politicians and others on this panel to decide what is the right approach there. But we had timelines, I think, of March 15th and sometime end of 2022 as being our original timelines, and that's probably a better way to go. But I'm curious about the language on spend done. Is that appropriation, or is that actually money spent and gone? When we say spend done, that's a little confusing to me, because I assume that some of this stuff is going to get spent out over a period of months or a year or two. So I don't know what spent done means specifically. But and then finally, the whole issue, and I've asked this before, and I really haven't got a clear answer in my mind as to the specific connectivity and behavioral health as it relates to the fiscal recovery funds. I thought that those two issues specifically were being handled by other ARPA money, as well as the proposed infrastructure bill to some extent. So I'm not sure how much time and resources we should be committing to those specific issues. And if we're kind of making a decision today as to where we're going, I'm a little concerned about a lot of wasted time and effort on those two specific issues. So those are my questions.
Okay, thank you. And I'll take a stab at these, and may need Secretary Burns-Wallace as well. So first, just on the timing, we agree. We got to get this right. But I think it's also important that we move with a sense of urgency, and that we direct the task groups to move with a sense of urgency, while also stressing that first, we want to have a thoughtful process where alternatives are weighed, and we've got all the options that are laid out. And so I think the language of up to is those are the words that matter the most here. So if we don't have good proposals, we won't approve money. It's that straightforward. On your question about the wording of spend done. So Will can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is for the recommendations for spending of up to $500 million would be made by December 31st. That doesn't mean the money is spent, but
no, it's allocated. Lieutenant Governor, it's basically allocated. It means that if the recommendation is approved by State Finance Council, those dollars are allocated, and would take an action to unallocate them accordingly.
Okay, thank you. So the money is not spent, but it is allocated. And then on connectivity and behavioral health, ultimately the Spark Task Force is set up to make these value decisions about where we prioritize our investments. And so there are dollars that may be coming for connectivity, as an example, broadband, through the infrastructure bill and so forth. We hope to have more clarity on that as we go into the fall and the winter. And so as we have that clarity, we can make these decisions about how much to invest in different areas. But going into the process, I think it's important that we have broadband as one of the focus areas that we've heard from business, from residents, from communities across the state, that this is key to not only quality of life, but to our economic health as a state. And we've got to have that as a priority, and same on behavioral health. And so this is a dynamic process that we're in. And a lot, as Secretary Burns-Wallace said, there's things that are changing all the time in terms of guidance we get from Washington, in terms of new bills that may be passed, which could influence a lot of this. And so having the phase 3 added on the timeline, I think is going to be really important, because of reallocations that we may be able to make, or other dollars that might come in that will, where decisions will need to be made down the road. So I hope that covers your questions, Bill. And
Lieutenant Governor, can I add just a little bit for a couple of areas? One, just adding on to what you mentioned around connectivity, even though that there are buckets of dollars that are identified potentially to go to broadband, each of those spaces still have an opportunity to get that direction or feedback from how they are specifically spent. And so it'll still be important to have a group of individuals that will help guide kind of the actual plan and what it looks like and where those investment points are. And having that stood up and available to be a part of as we access those federal dollars will actually make the state be able to get to them faster. Some of them will be, as we can see, directly allocated. Others might be more of where we have to apply for a competition. So having that panel, particularly in connectivity, can be very helpful when we have all of the information in our poised to be able to make those necessary decisions on that final plan and the plan of action in that space. So it will move and work a little bit differently than the other working groups. And we mentioned that at the very beginning, that it would work a little different than the other three that had been originally proposed. So you are right in pulling that piece out. The other thing I had heard expressed from a number around just kind of who is directing those work streams. I think one of the intents and for clarity around having that program coordinator that is not only hired by, but then directed by the executive committee, and maybe that word helps, to be able to give that direction to the areas that needed to be addressed or followed on. And then the work streams to support that effort will follow what that person brings from this executive committee. It's also why the idea of having dedicated contacts into the consultant so that lead coordinator is working directly with those leads in the consulting groups, making sure that they are delivering on the streams of information, questioning materials that is coming out of the executive committee. That is the intent. It is not designed to be, please understand, there is a lot of work to spread around. It is not an intent to try to take it over or bait and switch in any way. We want to be able to get the information to you all in the way that you're most comfortable. So trying to provide a lane where you have that person who's leading, who's able to then work with the consultants to pull all the necessary information quickly and accurately to match on your interest and your needs is what we're trying to come up with in a manner in which helps that you all feel comfortable, but that we're actually able to do it also in a timeliness so that we are not having a lag like we've seen in trying to provide you all that information directly. So thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Mr. Rolfe.
I might just make the point so I make sure I'm understanding everything right. I mean, us voting on this doesn't put anything in statute or in proviso. I mean, these are targets for our group. So if we're looking at proposals and we feel good about a couple of them and we need a little more information, there's nothing saying on February 4th we couldn't vote on another set of proposals or money. We're setting out targets and processes, but if we need more information, it can go over 12/31, right? We might have two that we want to vote for on that date and two that we need more information on that we could vote on 2 weeks later. Would that be right?
Yeah.
We have some flexibility, I guess.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right. I appreciate it.
Okay.
And with the idea that it doesn't have to be that formal, right? Like in between, if there are some things that we need to take action on, and you can still use those advisory committees, to help move those through if it's more of a, immediate need, kind of like, the situation we're talking about later today. If an advisory committee had been stood up, they could also have been helpful to weigh in, even though the decision would have been with exec. They could have, helped to provide context if there are other things. So I think, like you said, it's processes. These are kind of targets to kind of give us some structure, but that flexibility in between is, up to that group to be able to say, if we need to take action in between, that you still have that capability throughout.
I'll say I have full confidence in this group of working a hard and good process that's going to come out with good outcomes. We're seeing it already, so I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
a couple of other thoughts that I wanted to share. One is if you look at the original proposal that the private sector members put forth, We also did contemplate sort of rotating meetings of the Spark committee around the state, with the idea being that we wanted to make sure that there was some accessibility to people in other parts of the state to get ideas in front of this group and create, some avenue for them to think this is an open and transparent process, and actually genuinely be an open and transparent process. So I think we had proposed holding meetings in Wichita, holding meetings, potentially somewhere out west, holding meetings in the Kansas City area. And that sort of dovetails into a second sort of point I would have, which relates to the deadlines that we're talking about here. Part of the reason I think we establish deadlines is to make it clear to Kansans and to communities in Kansas and businesses, et cetera, that if you've got ideas that you want to get in front of the Spark committee, there are certain dates and times when we plan on considering investments, so that they don't feel like, gee, we're going to come up with something and get it to you, and you're going to say, oh, all the money's been spent. So in some senses, those deadlines are intended to be signals to members of the community, to other political subdivisions, that if you want your proposal or your idea or your investment considered by Spark, you can be confident that if you present it by this date, we're not going to tell you all the money's gone. And so, John, in that sense, I think those dates are important. In the sense that we don't want people to feel like they were shut out of this process. Any group, because, frankly, they wanted to get more community input, or they wanted to put together a better proposal, or they needed more facts before they did it, and they knew that we had this deadline. That's the other reason those deadlines were important. And one of the reasons in the private sector proposal we did make it March 15th and the end of the year was to recognize that 100% of the ideas that come before the Spark committee are not necessarily ideas that are going to emanate solely and exclusively from the advisory panels and the consulting firms that we have. Some of them are going to come from other parts of the state and from Kansans directly. And so, again, that's one of the reasons I think those deadlines are important as a signaling mechanism, so that people are comfortable. If we get our idea in by this date and time, at least it's going to get a fair hearing. Now, and if you note in that private sector proposal, we contemplated any idea that emanated outside of Spark, outside of our directed work streams, actually had a deadline that was a month prior to the Spark deadline, so that if we saw any of them that we thought really were, had a lot of merit, we could do our own work to validate the facts, to validate the proposal, and we would have that built-in month to consider a proposal that emanated from outside of this group. So again, not suggesting we have to, with the addition of the up to language, change those deadlines, but just want to put some context around why those dates matter. It's not just for when we spend money, but it's also a signal to the rest of Kansas that if you've got great ideas and proposals you want Spark to consider, you can rest assured that if you get it to us by this date, it's going to get a fair hearing.
Yeah, I think that's a important point. What we're saying with the deadline of December 31st, as an example, is we will not have spent or allocated more than $500 million. So that means that there's $850 million that's still potentially at play. And I think signaling that to the public and the stakeholders that we're going to engage this process is really important. So thank you for stressing that point. Yeah, Mr. Rolfe.
And I just want to reemphasize that idea of rotating these meetings. I'm a huge fan of, and I'm really grateful that Greg brought that back up. So,
yeah, transparency means showing up where people are and making sure that they've got a chance to be heard in ways that work for them. And so I think those process pieces are part of what we got to figure out as we go forward. And but yeah, I really like that part of the private sector proposal as well.
For the sake of full transparency, it was John's idea in the first place.
Thanks, John. And Greg. Okay, further discussion. Secretary Burns Wallace, would you like to restate your motion in narrative form so we can make sure we've got clarity on precisely what we're voting on?
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a different question before you do that, which would be to say, can this committee operate by unanimous consent? Meaning if the secretary were to put something in writing and circulate it, are we able to operate by all of us affixing our signature to it, or does it have to happen in a meeting?
I believe it has to happen in a public meeting like this.
In a public, any action by our committee needs to happen in a public meeting, is my understanding as well.
I would probably take a different side of that, say we are not taking actions that spends money. We're coming up with a process which to be able to spend that money. So I wouldn't have it. I don't think it's a firm line. I think it's important to get it right. But again, if we're taking actions that actually spends money that goes to the State Finance Council, this action does not go to the State Finance Council. This is just our processes. This is how we're gonna evaluate and set forth the direction to spend the money.
I think just to make sure that there aren't questions and that we're beyond reproach, if we can do this in a public meeting and have a public vote, that's how I would prefer to do it. Secretary, would you like to restate your motion?
Sure. So I am moving that we move the Spark process forward with the following. One, advisory panels made up of 8 to 10 experts selected by the executive committee. 2, focusing on the priority areas that include, first, economic revitalization, second, health and education, third, connectivity, and fourth, efficiency and modernization. The third component is around staffing, that for the Spark Executive Committee, a program coordinator will be hired and be under their direction, that the advisory panels would be jointly staffed by the Recovery Office and KLRD, pending the necessary legislative approval, and that the Executive Committee is assigned a dedicated point of contact from the consultants to work the necessary work streams identified by the Executive Committee. The last component being the timeline, with proposal of 3 potential rounds. Round 1, to receive recommendations to allocate up to $500 million by 12/31/2021. Round 2, for recommendations to allocate the remaining $834 million minus the portion that needs to be reserved for the UI trust fund transfer up to $250 million. This to be completed by 7/31/2022. And round 3, as needed for any additional allocations or reallocations, to be completed by 12/31/2022.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion and a second. We're going to do a roll call vote here to make sure we're fully in compliance with COMA. So President Masterson,
Aye.
Speaker Reichman,
Aye.
Secretary Burns Wallace,
Aye.
Mr. Orman,
Aye.
Mr. Pickert,
Aye.
Mr. Rolfe,
Aye.
and I vote aye as chair. Motion carries. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can we get that transcribed?
Yes, we will.
Thank you.
and we'll send it to the full committee. Okay, second item on our agenda is follow-up from our Friday conversation on the nurse and frontline care worker support. And I'm going to kick it to Mr. Rolfe to give us an overview. John?
Okay, I think you all probably remember it and have had some chances to have your own conversations. So I think discussion is going to be really important here. One thing I just wanted to make sure that was really clear from the proposal, I think it may have been communicated that we ended up with the premium pay option mainly due to the federal guidelines and ARPA around premium pay. The other that is part of why we ended up there, but really the main reason was twofold. And one, there was some concern about what one person mentioned to me as the black hole of hospital economics and P&Ls, where there's a lot of fungibility and how you move money around, which is true in a lot of different businesses. And wanting to create that accountability for the taxpayers that the money goes where it's supposed to go. It doesn't land somewhere and money moves around to make up for it. And with the second idea being that this money passes straight through to the frontline workers. It doesn't get absorbed into that P&L at any point. And so really the spirit of it was to keep this thing simple. You'll probably hear me come back to that at different points in our discussions. And is part of why this thing got stood up as quickly as it did, was how do we keep this simple with the idea of getting the money passed directly to the frontline nurses. Now, the second part of the direct pass through was there are concerns around piracy. So we did hear at the State Finance Council concerns around long-term care facilities and their shortage, and hospice and other areas where there are shortages, and we wouldn't want to advantage the hospitals, and that's where we lose some of the flexibility. I know, Mr. Speaker, that was important to you, and flexibility, I agree, is important. But if it's too flexible, that money could be used to poach. And so I'd like to make sure that it's clarified, and the addition is in this, that someone would have to have been employed by the hospitals as of September 1st of this year of 2021 to get this premium pay. So it's used for the people that have been there or that are there on the front lines, trying to convince them to stay in Kansas, to show our gratitude towards them. And so those are the two advantages of going to this direct pass-through premium pay, is it should keep there from being piracy, and it does create great accountability and getting that money straight through to the frontline workers, all under the spirit of keeping this thing simple. So I'll make the motion that, and I think I probably need to be subject to the same thing, Greg, that you requested of Secretary Burns Wallace. So I don't know, Lieutenant Governor Toland, if we need this thing right now, but I'd make the motion that we pass this as concept. And I assume this is what I need to do to create the discussion for this, is I need to make the first motion on it. I don't want to stifle discussion. That's not why I'm doing this. I want to open discussion. So I'd make the motion that we, as a baseline, take what we had with the on Friday with the clarification that it's September. The person needs to be employed as of September 1st of this year to be eligible. And then would make the motion and hope that it can be opened up for discussion or any questions you might have for me.
I think, Lieutenant Governor, I think with some of the clarity that needs to be made, we probably need to have a discussion a little bit prior to the motion, since we're already amending what appears to me the written language that was in the material passed out. So, and I know there was a broader discussion from based on my motion from last time. I think it got interpreted more precisely than it was meant, right? Everything, the media picked up on the vaccine mandate piece as we came out of that last set of meetings, that counterproductive measure, which I don't see in this, and would like to have some discussion around that in the motion. But it really was broader than just that. There's no place in government where we hand out the people's money where there are counterproductive actions on the backside, and there's a whole host of things those could be, whether those are grants or tuition assistance or water access and quality. The state does not hand out the people's money with a stated goal in mind to someone who, or some entity that has a counterproductive action. And I bring that, the reason I say it was broader is back COVID-1, right? First round, the way that implemented, we ended up with, and actually having some conversations with people this actually happened to. So some forced retirements, some furloughs, some layoffs, policies around personal time and quarantine. There were a host of things that were put into place that would be counterproductive to the stated public benefit goal for these dollars, which is more available staffed beds. And we even heard from Ascension last week that, they're at 50% of their census, right? So the whole purpose of this is staffed beds. It got, for political reasons, which frustrate me as well, they got myopically focused on one piece of that. So I think we need to have a little bit broader discussion, because this also brings me up the date that John brought. Because of some of the forced retirements that happened a year ago, there might be some value in that being available, at least to those who are in retirement. I totally agree with that. We don't want to be poaching long-term care. We don't want to be poaching. There's all kinds of entities that have, but there were forced retirements a year ago in that mess. And so where there is a resource there, there's a potential resource there for additional qualified, healthy people to staff these beds. And I want to make sure we're encompassing something around that reaches our stated goal, and to push back against the false narrative that, just any facility that has a vaccine mandate is ineligible. There does need to be discussion around, because there's all these simple adjustments to policies that would make them eligible. And because we're dealing with a population right now where the vaccine is so prolific, even on that point, where that's so prolifically available, those that are in favor, those that are ambivalent are getting vaccinated. And you have a cohort of healthy people that can help us with this stated goal. And we're going to start we're potentially funding money into a system that would discriminate against certain cohorts that are healthy and able to help us in this stated goal. So I think as we make this motion, it's important to me that we encompass some of those aspects in how it's produced.
Thank you, President Masterson. And so the motion that you made last week, I've got the transcript. The motion would be that we approve the request and that it's subject to the follow-up on the guardrails, parameters, and the eligibility requirement. There would be no counterproductive policies or mandates implemented that are counterproductive to what we are trying to accomplish. So that was the motion that was made and seconded and approved by the committee. So just
correct. And so I think where the clarity needs to come around is what maybe we need to clarify, either what counterproductive means or what the measurement of that is, right? For example, if you have a facility, and this is probably more of a risk in our rural areas, Western Kansas and some other areas where hospitals that can take COVID patients, but they have a higher number of those that may fit in a discriminatory cohort that might be then, those facilities even could risk being shut down. And I also want to make sure we're not, so I have 10 nurses quit, for example, but I'm using this money to bring 10 out of retirement when I could have had 20 nurses and meeting the goal of the stated goal of these staff beds. So I want to make sure we have some parameter in place that says we are maximizing the use of the people's dollars to maximize these beds. That's my concern. And vaccine mandates are part of that. And you can have this, but I think there should be some type of personal religious exemption that allows for these people to still help put in alternative robust testing requirements. And you need to maybe look at your policy on quarantine around that. Those are the things that I think are the most important for us to address versus just handing out cash and trusting.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. Other discussion? Speaker Reichman.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I still want to kind of stick along the guidelines, at least flesh out why we can't have our administrators be more flexible with this money. I know before we talked about just the buckets of premium pay. We think there's some other opportunities this could come from. again, I'm not an executive in a hospital, but after talking to a few, talking to a lot of the nurses across the state, there's other things besides just pay. There's their paid time off that some were forced to use for quarantine, or have to use their own benefits. Maybe there's a way to reimburse some of their benefits for paid time off. Maybe it's accessible to more mental health resources or physical health resources. And I also agree with Senator President when it comes to finding a way to get a lot of the people that retired or were forced to be retired to be back into the system. And I hate to have, I know I'm very sensitive to the pirating, but I think a date put in there like September 1st could maybe stop some of that happening. And so I want to be certain that this money can only be spent to increase payroll, because I understand it could have changed, it could be wrong. It's 3 months worth of increased payroll. Is that correct? Some nods of heads, kind of around for $50 million, 4 months. So what happens 4 months from now? Are they going to ask for another $50 million to continue it? And so I caution us to try to, unless we absolutely have to, there's not another option. And I think there are if we research and look into them. I don't think we had a chance to talk to our nurses and our doctors and our administrators to say, what ideas, what would you do with this money? You know your system way better than the 7 of us do. And so that's my caution. And again, some of the ideas that just have come through conversation are ones that I'm thinking of, which I know there's better ones out there. That there's more than just a $13 or $10 an hour bonus for 4 months that can incentivize and get us to the end. We also have, we talked a little bit on the edges about the profitability of some of our hospitals. I think some have lost money. I think some are actually could be gaining money during this time. And so how do we encourage that money to be spent to our frontline workers? There's a lot there, but hopefully this spurs on a little more conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And John or Secretary Burns-Wallace, can you talk about on the flexibility question, what is allowed under the American Rescue Plan Act for the use of these dollars in this particular context?
I will defer to Secretary Burns-Wallace on that one.
So what I would say is that one of the reasons that my understanding of, I think as John started, of coming at this from the premium pay standpoint is that when you start to move into utilizing these dollars in a broader way, the ARPA dollars have some very stringent aspects around their programmatic options. The way that we look at when we need to push out the dollars, it's both allowability, but it is also the program design and the compliance around how the dollars then need to be tracked and utilized. And it creates a level of complication, both from the administration, from the state, but for the subrecipient as well. So to give an example, let's say that you open it up where it's not just premium pay and some aspect is used for, as you mentioned, just regular pay or benefits or a different type of design. We then have to build the program completely differently around risk assessment, a verification by the subrecipients of their duplication of benefits, the ongoing monitoring. One of the components of being able to do the premium pay is it was one of the ways to ensure, one, it was a straight pass through that you could actually build a program so that it went straight through to the frontline workers with nothing being taken or utilized in other ways, and that there was a clean and quick and efficient way to be able to get the dollars out the door and into those hands because they are able to report directly on who received it, at what level, and how it moved to and through to those individuals. when we open up to different type of program design for the use of these dollars to say, one in this organization or a hospital is allocated X, Y, and Z, and they can use it this way, this way, this way, or this way, it is going to create a different level of complication for them to receive the dollars, for them to be able to verify their utilization and the allowability of what they're using the dollars for. They will have to be specific on how and what they're using the dollars before we can fully give them approval to even spend or use them. Under this design, when we push those dollars out, it'll be clear this is the only thing it can be used for. This is how it comes back in. And if there's any discrepancy, it's not allowable. So I think that in trying to meet this more of this particular situation was an immediate need. This particular situation was trying to help with retention, because as I think, and John may be able to speak to it, there are still other conversations going on trying to leverage other pots of dollars like FEMA on some of that recruitment of some additional talent. And there could be the potential in the future for dollars to go in a different way to support in this environment. But in an effort to get dollars out quickly to retain, my understanding is for this particular upcoming season, in particular with the increases we're seeing now and that they anticipate as they move into the winter, this was the fastest, most efficient, most accountable way on both sides to get those dollars in the hands to address retention. That's my understanding and how we kind of propose the program design behind it. John, I don't know if you want to speak more to that.
I think you summed it up well. I know a document went out a little bit before this meeting, looking at the different ways ARPA could be spent. But I think when you start moving into payroll or compensating someone for their time, that's when you start getting into the deeper guidelines. And I didn't really push back on it when we're talking through it very hard, because it helped with the getting the money to the nurses. It helped with the accountability, and it helped. The other thing we were wanting to not see happen was someone do a $3,000 bonus and then the person quit and go to Texas, right? And so this goes as you're working, you get the money going. If you quit or leave or move, then that stops that flow as an out migration. So, and I just urge again, you'll hear me say it 10 times, but the temptation will be to complicate this. I think in the end, we really want to do our best to keep it simple, but I think this is a really good discussion to have.
Thanks, John. Mr. Pickard?
I just want to thank John for all the work he's done on this proposal. I think it's outstanding. I think it's focused on the things it needs to be focused on in terms of paying people for additional work. We're in the middle of a crisis right now. We need every nurse we can get on the front line taking care of patients. And so the fact that we're focused on paying people for work and the hours that they're working is, I think, exactly where we ought to be focusing these dollars. I appreciate the fact that you've added the caveat they had to be an existing employee at September 1, so we're not incentivizing hospitals to go out and compete in the labor market with all the other healthcare providers out there that are employing nurses as well. And so the only other thing I was wanting to see if we could do is add the specific funding provision of $5,000 per licensed bed. That's not really spelled out in the proposal as it's written, and it's in the calculation, I know, but it's not in the actual outline. So at least I didn't see it. So if we could add that to it, that'd be, I think, something to make more clarity as to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and Bill, I don't believe the calculation is per licensed bed straight. It moved to a calculation of the estimated workforce based on the licensed beds, which came out to about 9,600 and frontline workers. And so that's where the $5,000 number gets times against that, if that makes sense. And so, just as a reminder for everybody, that calculation is based on the ratios of 6 inpatient beds to every nurse, 2 ICU beds to every nurse, and then a plus 20% for the additional frontline workers it takes to support those beds.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
And you know, if this wing was a $30 to $50 million, you change that by, if you think it's $3,000 is the right number, then that changes it to close to 30 million. If it's 5,000, it gets it up close to 50 million. And that's the number. And the thought for me is, and the guiding principle was that this was something that could get us through this winter and this current surge capacity issues that we're dealing with.
But it's still 5,000 then per imputed number of employees. Is that what I'm hearing?
Correct.
Okay. Like I said, the 5,000, the 5,000
Estimated
is
frontline
not,
workers. Yeah.
okay. The 5,000 I don't think is specified.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Orman?
A couple of thoughts, and John, obviously I've shared a number of these with you offline as well. You know, again, this sort of highlights a process issue as well, which is, I think at the last meeting, there was sort of an implication that the reason we're doing premium pay is it's the only available bucket of dollars that we have. You know, that's now since morphed into, well, it's the administratively the easiest way to do it. And, you know, we at least know where the dollars are going. And, you know, that's laced with a certain level of mistrust, apparently, with the healthcare institutions and the state, that they're not going to use the dollars for the intended purpose. You know, I spent some time yesterday reading the interim final rule. I read Title IX of ARPA, which relates to the funds that went to the state. And there are clearly lots of other ways for us to get dollars to healthcare providers and give them the flexibility that Speaker Reichman has asked for. I don't know, you know, again, I looked at what the perceived administrative burdens were in the interim final rule, and it looks like it's largely around record keeping and ensuring that the dollars are spent in an appropriate way and that the need is justified in a way that can be validated. I don't know that I necessarily think that's an unreasonable burden to place on a healthcare institution. When we had the CEO from Ascension at our last meeting, and he talked about the steps that they were taking to keep nurses employed in the front line and achieve what President Masterson indicated, staffed hospital beds. He talked about all sorts of tools that they were using, things like shift premiums to get people to take on an additional shift so that a worker who normally works 5 shifts is now working 6. You know, there was some component of pay to it, but he mentioned 3 or 4 other strategies that they were using to keep people retained. And again, I think this proposal ultimately takes a very cookie cutter approach to it and not a targeted approach. And my suspicion is, if I were the CEO of a hospital system, you know, I might want to do more to retain people who are actually in frontline COVID related positions. And, you know, maybe not as much to retain people who were working in nursing positions that weren't as directly exposed to the pandemic. Understanding that that's you know, one workforce, and in theory that person could get enticed to go somewhere else. I understand the concern about them paying a big bonus and having that person walk away, but again, any CEO of a hospital who does that, in my mind, is really not very thoughtful. You know, anytime you're in a situation of financial distress and you're looking to keep employees, you don't give them bonuses up front, you give them stay bonuses that say things like, you know, if you're here on December 31st, you're going to get a $4,000 bonus. You know, so again, I think we're letting our desire to get the dollars out there efficiently create a scenario where the dollars aren't used as effectively as they could be. And that's my principal concern. I also do agree with Speaker Reichman, having looked at the public filings of a number of healthcare systems. You know, their EBITDA margins in 2019 were lower than their EBITDA margins in 2020 and in the first 2 quarters of 2021. So at least for the public healthcare systems that I've been able to review financials on, it looks like they're making more money post-pandemic than they were making pre-pandemic. And so any money that we send out to those hospitals, I would also have a caveat in it that says if in a post audit it's determined that you're making EBITDA margins that are greater than your 2019 EBITDA margins, you have to give the money back. Again, if the goal here is to help them meet the critical needs related to the pandemic, I think we want to make sure those are genuine needs. And frankly, reading through ARPA and reading through the interim final rule, it's clear that that was the intent of the legislators in Washington when they wrote this. They wanted it to be separate and distinct from the first relief bills that contain no accountability in them. So again, I think I understand the desire to be expeditious here and simplify it and ultimately get dollars out there to frontline workers. I think that's preventing us from being as effective as we could possibly be with these dollars. And ultimately, I'm concerned that we're not going to be accomplishing the goal that we're trying to accomplish, at least not to the extent we could. One other thought is, if we are going to go through with this plan, I agree with President Masterson that if you're going to make an amendment to it, it should be someone who's on your payroll as of September 1 or has retired from your organization, between, in sometime in the prior 2 years, so that you can get at those people who have retired, many of whom may have retired because they were concerned about exposing themselves to the COVID environment. And now maybe they're vaccinated and they know there's higher vaccination rates at the hospital. They might want to come back because they've made the decision to make themselves to make themselves safer in this environment. And so, ultimately, I think if we're going to go with this proposal, we do need to allow for people who have retired to come back into the workforce. Because I think, again, if I were a CEO of a health system, the first thing I would do if I had this extra bucket of dollars is call every one of those nurses, many of whom are baby boomers who are got close to retirement age and just decided we can't take this anymore. And I'd have a concerted effort to get them back on the payroll.
Thank you. Mr. Rolfe, were you trying to get in? Okay.
Lieutenant Governor, I've got a potential suggestion. As we motion, and someone's gonna have to help actually phrase the motion, because I agree with a lot of concerns. And I actually had not even thought about it. I appreciated Greg's input on the earnings piece of that and how we are accountable for the public dollars. What I think maybe we should look at is approving, but having more of a review on the backside that allows, because of the obviously we have the stated goal of increasing the staff beds. We've had the stated goal of no poaching. We've got the stated goal of not increasing earnings. So we could phrase basically approve and allow. So no hospital, because I was even thinking on the vaccine mandate piece. If a hospital has that and no nurse quits because of it, that's not a problem, right? It wasn't counterproductive. But if you have an institution that does happen in, then that is counterproductive. And so maybe simply have anybody who is asking for these dollars or qualifying for these dollars have the understanding that there's a reimbursement or clawback, and we just put those parameters in what they had counterproductive policies. And that again can be whether that's quarantine policies, testing policies, vaccine policies that are counterproductive, and you're forcing healthy nurses out of the market, and you're discriminating versus accommodating. Basically, they'd be operating under, they may go back voluntarily and look at some of their policies and how it would affect their earnings if they know they're subject to reimbursement or clawback on the post end of it. Meaning we could get this money working, but there would be an understanding that there's clawback and reimbursement. Because if I'm a CEO and I understand that this might be a clawback, I'm going to make sure my policies and procedures accommodate where I don't have to have that clawback. So it might be more of putting a parameter on the backside, and this committee could even review that, right? This is a 4-month deal and we're spending money for the next 2 years. We could have documents from the hospitals that have a look back on it. So we can get off the fence right now and get these urgent dollars. But we do need to consider the earnings piece, the discriminatory piece, and let the hospitals decide what that is.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Is there a way, speak, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair.
Mr. Rolfe.
Is there a way to run to ground for this committee where we stand on the unproductive policy thing? I'd counter the opposite of my colleague here, President Masterson, that I think I could have a strong argument that the counter productive policy is not mandating the vaccine in your hospital. So
Certainly be a weak argument though, because you have because
so
people that are comfortable with it, right? Those are the people that are comfortable. And just, I know it's anecdotal, but my daughter and her friend, I just asked, I said, do you know anybody inside the system you work with? And I've now responded to several emails, same thing. Do you know anybody that would quit if a vaccine is not mandated? And none of them could name a single person. So I know it sounds good from a perspective of argument, but I don't think you'll have any practical application. And you have people that is this. Matter of fact, there's another side of this that we haven't even discussed about even the constitutional aspect, right? We've got an amendment on the ballot coming up in August that talks about personal autonomy. Right now, that as it pertains to abortion, and right, we're having an argument about whether there's two bodies there. But the truth is, if you can apply personal autonomy to a two-body situation where somebody's pregnant, you certainly can apply it to this. And then you have a whole constitutional argument about coercing somebody to do something against their belief or maintain their employment, right? So I'm just saying there needs to be some accommodation for sincerely held religious belief. There needs to be some accommodation for personal autonomy. And I'm not saying we're saying right now you don't qualify if you have a policy, but let the hospitals decide how that affects them. And if they do anything that is counterproductive, I think clearly we need to have a reimbursement, just like if they're using it to hit their bottom line.
Yeah, and I just don't know if we need to how we have this discussion, or if we need to have a vote. It'd be good to know where we stand on this issue. It came up when I was putting this together, recommended by some healthcare professionals that to qualify for the money that you should have a certain percentage of your workforce vaccinated, as in most people in the healthcare industry would agree that the vaccine is our way out of this pandemic. But I didn't want this to become a political debate around vaccinations. All this is the idea of this is to get money to frontline workers to protect capacity. And so, and I think place you and I generally agree, President Masterson, is that we don't want to tell private businesses what they should be doing with their policies inside of their business. But I don't know how I'd like to run that, Mr. Chair, to ground on what we feel like is an unproductive policy or productive policy, which may dictate then around some of the flexibility and other parts of the conversation that are coming up.
We do need to run this to ground.
You can take a vote if you want, whether or not you believe that, Mr. Lieutenant Governor, you could take a vote amongst this group to see whether or not they think it's beneficial to hand money to an entity that's doing something counterproductive on the backside.
Well, I think
that's the
Senator
motion.
Masterson, everybody agree that we don't want anything counter. It's how you define the term counterproductive is the issue, and that's what we need to run to ground.
So that's why I say you do it on the backside, right? We go ahead and approve the motion, but there is reimbursement and clawback possibilities that can be reviewed later on, and then let the hospital decide in their situation whether or not their policies line up with that. Because I'm not telling the business, right? We would not be telling businesses what to do. This is not that situation. We're not telling anybody what to do with their money. We are saying what it means for you to be handed the people's money. Because our stated goal is more available staff beds, period.
Mr. President, just a question as I'm thinking through this and listening to this discussion. There are so many factors that are ultimately going to affect workforce at these hospitals. Obviously, the extent to which the pandemic gets worse might affect the workforce. People might get burned out and quit. Obviously, we're trying to stem the flow of people moving into contract nursing, and the proposal on the table is another $13 an hour. But we've heard from the health systems that they're paying up to $140 an hour for contract nurses. So we still might not be doing enough from a pay standpoint, and people might leave because of pay. I'm trying to think through in my own head, how would you measure that and know that if their staffed beds went down, it was the direct result of a policy as opposed to any number of other factors that are obviously at play and what I consider to be a very fluid situation right now.
So I guess if we're trying to run this to ground and we stick on the issue that has become the vaccine mandates, right? If I contend it's an easy measurement. If I have a vaccine measurement and 10 nurses quit, that was counterproductive. I didn't accommodate them at all, period. So, and if I'm the minority on this, I'm just arguing for what I believe is sound logic in our stated goal and accountability for the people's money. If you want to cast a vote just on that issue, I'm glad to cast my vote in favor of not allowing for vaccine mandates and accommodating these people. And I'm for testing. Matter of fact, I'm for testing the vaccinated. What we've seen is even those that are fully vaccinated have been shown to have and spread the virus. I think it'd be wise to test them because you want healthy people manning beds, period. So, but if you want to cast a vote on that alone, I'm sure happy to take that vote and we can just move off a dead center.
Well, we have a motion.
We don't have a second though.
Right, but John, would you restate your motion, please, just to refresh everyone?
My motion is that we approve the original proposals laid out with the addition of that someone needs to be employed as of September 1st, 2021 to qualify for the premium pay.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second? I second as chair.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'd make a substitute motion that we approve as presented with the September date added and I want dates on the retirement and 2-year prior retirement to that date coming out of retirement. And that I'll just keep it simple then, see where your votes are. And that a facility that institutes a vaccine mandate would not be eligible for that assistance.
Okay. So we have a substitute motion. Is there a second on the substitute motion? Okay.
I'll second the motion.
We have a second from Mr. Pickert. Discussion on the substitute motion.
Mr. Lieutenant Governor, I'd like to actually amend that if it's okay with my second to account for the earnings, the EBITDA piece represented by Mr. Orman, that it's also reimbursed if their EBITDA is increased.
Mr. Pickert, is that acceptable to you?
I'm not sure I follow what that exact adjustment would be. And
I'll remove it to sustain my second.
Okay. All right. Further discussion on the substitute motion? Speaker Reichman?
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I think we have a lot of things that we can do one-off votes on. I'm still concerned about a 5% premium pay, if that's still in there for who administers it. Not premium pay. I'm about a 5% surcharge. I'm concerned that this money can only go out of the premium pay bucket, that we're not allowing the flexibility to our administrators to work with our nurses to see what they want, how to spend this money. Again, is it money spent on mental health issues, on physical health issues? Is it to extend their benefits? We've not even discussed how we can maximize those dollars with some of the local money that's been received. And so I think we can do one-off substitute motions all day and not come up with the right policy. The proposal that we have before the substitute motion in front of us is almost identical to the one that we didn't want last week. We wanted more time to discuss and talk about. Mr. Orman's gone through and read the actual law. Has found lots of more flexibility in there. That's not just premium pay. Again, I'm not sure how much we've heard from our executives and our nurses to say, how would you use this money? If it's, Boston Consulting had a few conversations with, I think, Mr. Rolfe, but not with the rest of us. And so I don't know what we're trying to accomplish by, I I see Senator Masterson's point on the vaccine mandates as far as being counterproductive, but also see John Rawls' point that there'd be some nurses, and I've heard from nurses that would leave if they don't. I'm concerned about some of the nurses that are in the hospitals already been mandated. I think of KU Med. A big chunk of our workforce is at KU Med right now. I don't want to see them being punished if somehow they can't participate in this program, whatever it is. And so, I mean, I don't know if we're ready to have motions and substitute motions. It seems like we're just going to come up with a process that no one's going to be like. It's going to like. It's be very confusing. If I was a nurse or a hospital exec right now, I'd have no idea what you guys are talking about, and I've been studying it. And so I don't know. I mean, outside of just keep voting on motions or ultimately passing one that really no one's happy with, I think it's premature. Again, this is $50 million. That is a ton of money that we're making a decision on that I don't think there's good clarity with more than 2 or 3 people on this panel. Maybe we're looking at, we know we have immediate need. I recognize and appreciate what Mr. Pickard said about the immediate need for our nurses. Maybe it's a small percentage of the 50 that goes out the door at 13 under premium pay, just so we have a chance to get the relief that's needed right away. To give this body more time to be deliberate, if we're going to tie it to earnings, if we're going to allow other buckets of money to be used that aren't quite restrictive just for premium pay, if we can come up with a way to identify what is counterproductive. And so maybe we ought to be entertaining something along those lines instead of just voting on things that are just going to cause confusion and probably not lead to a great end product.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I might, put out there that I'm concerned that we're letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. We have listened to our healthcare professionals, our hospitals, who've made clear what it is they need and when they need it, and they need it now. We have the dollars at our disposal. They have been approved by the State Finance Council, and I think it's our job today to give clarity on what the parameters are on that. And so right now we've got both a motion and a substitute motion. Substitute motion has been seconded. Is there additional discussion on the substitute motion?
Yeah, I would just like to add on to my comments. When I've heard from executives, they want flexibility. When I've heard from nurses, they also want flexibility and other options. It wasn't just a pay. It was let us be innovative. Again, the nurses I spoke with, they talked about mental health needs, physical health needs, some of the benefits they had to use themselves to take time off for being in quarantine, maybe the reimbursement of some of those. It wasn't just a flat $13 an hour increase. Maybe you had different conversations, but those aren't the ones that I had. And I don't know if we want to vote down a substitute motion and then another motion. And then I know, Greg, you've stated some things along the lines I think all of us agree with. We're going to get back to that. Or we want to do something that's just a percentage of it now to get us started. But if we're going to stick, I'll probably be voting no on the substitute and vote no on the underline if it doesn't change.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Other discussion? Okay. Yeah, John.
I just make the quick point, piggybacking off of what Speaker Eichmann said. I think it's 40% of the state's hospital beds are under the hospitals that have already declared a vaccine mandate. So that's what we're talking about, clearing off the table.
So, Lieutenant Governor, I would disagree with that. Because this money is not being allocated for some weeks. There's plenty of time. This does not disqualify any institution. They have time to review a policy and make some accommodation to keep these nurses on our front lines. This does not, I want to make that clear because that was misreported, in and of itself disqualify any institution. There's plenty of time to adjust policy before any of these things come out. Every nurse in every one of those facilities could reap the benefits of this, and that would be a choice of the facility.
Thank you, Mr. President. Okay. On the substitute motion, we have a second. I'm sorry, Secretary Burns Wallace, were you trying to get in? Okay, gotcha. All right. So we have a motion and seconded, and so President Masterson,
Aye.
Speaker Reichman,
No.
Secretary Burns Wallace,
No.
Mr. Orman,
No.
Mr. Pickert,
Yes.
Mr. Rolfe,
No.
and I vote no. Motion fails. Going back to the original motion, which Mr. Rolfe made and I seconded. Additional discussion. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Lieutenant Governor. I will be voting no on this one as well. Again, we need to talk about other buckets of money besides premium pay. We need to talk about giving the innovation and flexibility to our doctors and our nurses and our hospitals to find out what they think needs to be done. If we want to just have something that get us done today, and we take a percentage of the 50 million, I could support that to give us some more time to flush some of the things out. I think we're doing a disservice if we're just going to vote on this as this one option. I think we're also leaving money on the table with the chance for locals to participate, to grow this 50 to maybe 60 or 70 million dollars over time. But if we want to keep to the structure that's identical to last week, with addition of making sure we're not pirating, to include a September 1st hire date, or if it also includes a 2-year look back on folks that are retired, it was a temporary or only a percentage of the money, I can support something like that. But to do this this way, I think it's a disservice and not a good use of the $50 million that we were given.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. John, Mr. Rolfe.
Yeah, and I just want you to know I'm very comfortable with substitute motions and conversation like this. I didn't make the motion to try and jam it through, but if we need to do an up-down on it, I'm fine with that too. The belief I have, Speaker Reichman, and we don't see it differently, is I like the innovation, I like the creativity. I believe we're seeing in this current crunch probably more innovation and creativity around staffing and hiring out of the healthcare and hospital industry than we've probably seen in a very, very long time. That they're using tools and triggers and things with their own resources and all this. This is, not to stymie that or to say this is the only pot of money for that, but for us to help on the retention piece alone of pushing the money out to the frontline workers and getting it to them. So I believe that innovation is already happening, and I do believe that most hospitals have the resources to try and be innovative. The one thing on the EBITDA conversation, you're able to pull that from publicly traded hospitals, which are large entities. They're very unlike the majority of hospitals in the state of Kansas and our rural hospitals and all that. So I have a sense of urgency around this, mainly because of rural Kansas, not only in the retention out there, but as the tertiary centers, the large hospitals and the high population centers are getting log jammed, it's pushing more acute care out into those hospitals where they're don't have the same abilities to care for those acute patients. And so I do think there's time of the essences on this thing, more so than maybe some of the other projects we'd look at.
Thank you, Mr. Rolfe. Additional discussion? Sorry, Mr. Orman, was that you?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So John, again, just to be clear, all I did was provided information based on what was available to me. And again, I agree, Kansas hospitals are going to be in a different situation. And, frankly, most of the hospitals, the larger public hospitals, even the mid-sized public hospitals, many of them are in states that have very different environments than we have in Kansas, like Most of them are in states with Medicaid expansion, and that obviously has a different impact as well on their financial situation. All I'm saying is, if you're making more money during the pandemic than you were making pre-pandemic, you probably don't need our dollars. You know, and again, if every hospital system in Kansas is, you know, has significantly lower levels of profitability or is losing money because of the pandemic, I think that's precisely the purview of the ARPA dollars. So it's not to imply that they are, but we haven't gotten clarity from any of them, and you know, we've had the opportunity to speak to many of them, and I've asked them all that question and haven't gotten a clear answer from them when I've said, are you making more money now than you were making pre-pandemic? There doesn't tend to be a direct yes or no answer to that question. And so again, I just want to make sure we're being consistent with the spirit of the law, which is these dollars are intended to compensate businesses that have genuine economic hardships related to the pandemic. So that was my only comment there. You know, if you read the premium pay section of ARPA and you read it as it relates to it, it says by providing, you know, we can use the dollars use of funds to provide workers performing essential work, public health emergency, by providing premium pay to eligible workers of the state, territory, or tribal government that are performing essential work, or providing grants to eligible employers that have eligible workers who perform essential work. I mean, you know, you can, the language is in there that basically says we can either provide premium pay or provide that pay to the employers. And I wouldn't have any problem saying we've agreed to earmark $50 million. We've agreed to a methodology to determine how that gets allocated across the healthcare system in Kansas. And then let's say to the healthcare providers, these dollars are specifically to be used to retain employees, and specifically to be used on measures that were not in place prior to September 1. So it would be in addition to whatever else they're doing. And, you know, there would be some back end accountability to that. Yes, you have to keep track of how you spent the money, and you have to demonstrate that it was spent in service of the goal of retaining or bringing back potentially retired staff, adding to capacity. And ultimately, the only other trigger is, you know, you have to provide some financial reporting to demonstrate that in 2021, you made less money than you made in 2019. Because again, I don't think if they're profiting from the pandemic, I don't think we have a need to provide these dollars. So, you know, I think we can get the money out there right away using the mechanisms that you've proposed. It would just be, you know, a mechanism that would give them the flexibility. If they're entitled based on the number of beds they have, the number of ICU beds they have, they're entitled to $800,000. You can send the $800,000 out, you know, tomorrow, as far as I'm concerned. And let them use that the way they want to use it, flexibly, innovatively, and ultimately in service of retaining our frontline healthcare workers.
Thank you, Mr. Orman. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Tolan. I really appreciate this discussion. I know I've heard John mention that a few times about how well great this group works together. And Secretary, I think Tolan, you set the tone for that and the way you chair the meetings. I think we're kind of in a spot here where we're probably not going to vote on something we're comfortable with. I'll make a substitute motion that our private sector guys, they did such a good job working together last time, that they get together the next couple of days and kind of put a proposal kind of built around what the discussions we've had today. And maybe we can vote on that as early as this Friday or Monday of next week. But if they're open to that, again, haven't talked to the three of them, that maybe they can put some of these ideas, pencil to paper, flush out with the consultants, have a chance to talk to our CEOs, talk to our nurses to see what's possible, and then bring back a proposal that we can feel more comfortable with. And I think we'll stretch our dollars and actually help the goal of providing more bed space or retain the ones that we have. So I'll make a motion that our private sector folks offline discuss the proposal and bring it back to us, hopefully by next Friday, unless that day doesn't work, if it's practical.
Next Friday being in 2 days, or next Friday being in 9
I'm
days?
thinking in 2 days.
Okay. We have a substitute motion. Can I just, for discussion purposes, our private sector members, is this something you can do in the next 48 hours?
Well,
I know Mr. Pickert might have, he's got some other events he's tending to, but I can make time for it. I don't know about Mr. Orman.
well, I would suggest, other than Bill and John not being my favorite two people to spend time with, I can make it work.
Bring your bottles. I'll wash them.
I can make it work as well.
Hey, so let me just get the questions we're trying to answer here, Mr. Speaker, would be the questions around flexibility, right? And what would there be one or two other questions you might frame for us?
Some of the flexibility, do we have to stick to the premium pay part? Does it allow our executives to provide other benefits to nurses that are healthy during this time? Like I mentioned, more access to mental health or physical health, their benefits outside of pay, if it's vacation, if it's time off, if it's sick leave, if it's more incentives for bonus pay for different shifts. Those are things that I think the folks that are in day-to-day this with information and feedback from the nurses themselves could be very helpful. I also think there's a discussion, is there some type of incentive for locals to participate in this? Again, if the three guys don't see a need to that, if we come back to this original idea, I think just a little more time. And again, we're paying consultants a lot of money. They should have a lot of these answers for us. And if they can be a part of these conversations, it could be helpful. But that's kind of along the lines that I was looking at.
I would also add, I think you're looking for what are the mechanisms for accountability.
Right, exactly. Accountability, if it's EBITDA, whatever it is, whatever the Senator Master said and Mr. Norman's has stated, that provides a little more accountability.
Okay. So we have a motion. Is there a second?
I already seconded, actually. You didn't hear me.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. So we've got a motion and a second. Mr. Rolfe.
Do we need to take a vote and have action on this, or do I just need to remove my original motion and we plan to meet on Friday?
The way I understand it is we vote on the substitute motion first, and then depending on what happens there, we'll come back to the original motion. And if I've got the parliamentary procedure wrong, somebody can tell me now, but I believe that's right.
Yeah,
If
I
the
didn't know if
substitute motion passes, we're done, and if it doesn't, you're back on the first.
All right. I just didn't know if I could remove it and the whole house of cards came down. So not fresh on my Robert's rules.
Yeah.
You have to have the second, you have to have the substitute motion removed, then you could remove, and then you're back at state.
Okay. All right. We'll let the chair run this thing, not me. Sorry.
No, you're good, John. Okay. On the substitute motion, it's been moved and seconded. Additional discussion.
Can it be repeated?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, would you repeat your motion?
My substitute motion is that our private sector folks get together in the next 2 days and come up with a proposal that basically reflects the conversations that we've had today. And we meet again on Friday.
Okay.
Now, just outside my motion, just remind the three members that due to the violations, you can't discuss it with anybody else on this panel. Otherwise, you make a connectivity that would violate the open meetings law.
That's correct. Okay. Additional discussion?
Call previous question.
Yeah, John?
I'll call previous question on the motion. On the second, on the revised motion to move us along here.
Okay, so going to the vote, President Masterson,
Aye.
Speaker Reichman,
Aye.
Secretary Burns Wallace,
Aye.
Mr. Orman,
Aye.
Mr. Pickard,
Aye.
Mr. Rolfe.
Aye.
I vote aye. Motion carries. Substitute motion carries. So I would ask the recovery office and the consultants to make themselves available to whatever the three private sector members need in terms of information on best practices, interpretation of federal regs, whatever it might be, so that they can meet the directive of the task force to be back within 48 hours. It would be our hope, if possible, to also meet on Friday, so that we can put this to bed this week if possible. If Friday is not possible, then on Monday. So we will, through the recovery office, be back with all of you to try and find a date that is workable to the entire committee. So we've done good work here today. This has been the kind of good, civil, thoughtful conversation that is how it should be done. So I want to thank the task force for these conversations. Before we adjourn, are there any other issues that anyone would like to bring forth to the group?
Can I ask one question of Secretary Burns Wallace, which is, in reading through Title IX of ARPA, subtitle N, which provides for up to $8.5 billion to healthcare providers, which is ultimately going to be doled out federally. Is that something that Whit O'Brien is working on with our healthcare providers to make sure that they're able to access those dollars as well?
Yeah, typically the way we've worked it is we've taken apart things like that where outside or independent entities have to apply directly. We've taken the bills apart, and we did this under CRF as well. And like by sector, like we try to corral everything and then get things ready. And then to help to push that information out, we did this with small businesses and different ones. And so part of it is also the timing of when the additional information comes out on some of those pieces, which some of that hasn't even happened for ARPA. And it takes there's a little bit of delay, but that I don't know off the top of my head, that particular section, but that's what we've done in many cases, because there are large buckets that had to be applied directly by those sectors, that being one of them. And each time we've tried to be more of that resource to make sure we hold webinars, we push out kind of distilled information, things of that nature to help them. We also publish when we know those deadlines are ready and the links to apply and things like that. But I can get you, when you guys connect, because Whit O'Brien will be one of the groups of consultants that'll support your conversation. I'll make sure that they let you know about that particular subsection and if they've gotten the additional information on that one out yet.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay, if no other items, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. Thank you, everyone. We will be back shortly. Take care.